Chapter 8 is about performance assessments. So the outcome of this chapter, after reading through it and hearing the lecture, you will learn about performance assessments and be able to distinguish between accurate and inaccurate statements regarding the nature of performance tests and assessments. You'll be able to identify the different types, and you'll learn how to score them properly. So this is the outline. We'll again talk about the definition of performance assessments. We will talk about two big problems or things to consider, one of which is the generalizability dilemma. Another is includes other factors to remember. We'll talk about rubrics, which are often used in scoring performance assessments. We'll discuss creating different ratings and the observation itself, and then we'll look at some sources of error that often occur in scoring performance assessments. So performance assessment is an approach to measuring a student's status based on the way the student completes a specific task. They're meaningfully different from binary choice or multiple choice like we talked about in the last two chapters. In performance assessments, students must perform a task, and a teacher or the other observers assess it to determine the student's mastery of the task. So if a teacher wants to develop an assessment for her learning objective that involves collaborative problem solving, which is the example that's presented to you in the book, or if they're going to be, say, working with a peer to solve their problem, then the teacher may need more than a selected response type of assessment. So you can see here in number 1 and number 2, if the curricular aim is that students can solve problems collaboratively, giving a selected response like true, false, or multiple choice might not really get at whether or not the students can solve problems collaboratively. If you look at number 3 and number 4, similarly, even though these are constructed response assessments, again, they may not be able to provide a valid means to understanding students' mastery of this curricular aim or objective. So that's why number 5 is going to be the best option, and this would lend to a performance type assessment. So you can see, I think this is a great example to show you how there are lots of different kinds of assessments that can be used, and how even though other ones can kind of hit at where you want to be, the fifth one is really going to be the best. And as we talked about several chapters ago on validity, this is going to provide that valid link, that content validity that you're after when you're teaching a specific task. So you're likely familiar with authentic assessments, which assess students' knowledge and application of content in a situation that's similar to what they would do in the real world. It's something that's different from, say, a worksheet or a paper pencil test. So these types of assessments are preferable for many reasons, because they motivate students by helping them to understand the reason for learning the content. However, these types of tasks can be more demanding because they require that students use higher level skills to apply the content that they've used. Often, these tasks assess students' cognitive processes in applying strategies, thinking critically, and using creativity. And we'll talk a little more about this on the next slides. In further defining performance assessments, most educators agree that 3 essential components be in place. Number 1, they must have multiple evaluative criteria. So, for example, in a speech, you'd consider the content, students' speaking ability, and then perhaps students' ability to relate to the audience. Also, performance, number 2, performance standards should have criteria that are given to students in advance so that students can appropriately prepare for the task at hand. Finally, the third feature is that much of the performance assessment is dependent on human judgments. Instead of an answer key, like in constructed response or selected response, the assessment is scored based on what a grader believes fits most closely with the scoring criteria. So in order to increase reliability, there are certain standards that must be put into place. So performance assessments do have a lot of advantages, some of which I just mentioned, such as the ability to encourage higher level thinking skills, the ability to use authentic learning experiences, a way to motivate students because of the value that they're likely to have for the performance itself, and the ability to help students recognize the importance of developing those specific skills. But there are disadvantages in that these performance assessments take a lot of time to construct, especially because of the time it takes to make the rubrics, making sure that they're good rubrics. In addition, performance assessments take time to score in order to ensure that the grader scores them objectively and reliably. In creating performance tasks, identify a few tasks or even just one task within a unit of instruction. Because they can take a lot of time to create and score, you'll want to choose carefully the types of tasks that you'll want students to do. In addition, because the tasks usually measure higher level skills, you won't have time to do them daily. Students will need to learn some of the basic skills first, and then this might be a culminating type of project. They do need to be aligned well to the curriculum and represent valid measures of the course objectives. So because these assessments are often used as summative assessments, they are used to make inferences about a student's understanding of an objective, or even an inference about students' understanding of the entire unit of study. So care should be considered when you create and assess performances. So in this figure, you can see how the student responses to performance assessment tasks are then used to make an inference about student status, which should then determine one's understanding of the objective or the standard. Because performance tasks only require that students complete a few tasks, it's often more difficult to generalize what they know based on their ability to complete the performance task. If you're trying to determine whether students are able to create their own personal narrative in a 20-minute time period, this is different than if you were able to assess them in multiple styles of writing on a short essay test. Gaining that one sample of their work may make generalizing their abilities much more difficult. There are 7 criteria for evaluating performance tests. The first one is generalizability. You want to consider whether the performance task created will generalize to comparable tasks. The next criteria is authenticity. You want to know whether the performance task is one they are likely to experience in the real world. The third evaluative criteria is multiple foci. You'll want to make sure that the performance test does in fact measure multiple outcomes rather than just one. In your rubric, you can assure this by creating multiple evaluative criteria upon which to focus. You also want to make sure that your performance assessments are teachable, meaning that with practice through instruction, students will be able to increase their understanding of the content to improve on the performance assessments. The fifth evaluative task focuses on fairness. As we talked about fairness in Chapter 5, remember that the task avoids bias based on students' backgrounds. Consider whether students need certain materials or help from parents or background knowledge to complete the tasks. The sixth criteria is feasibility. Similar to fairness, consider whether students will be able to do it. Is it realistic, given the time constraints or resources available? And then the last criteria is scoreability. Can students' scores or performances be accurately scored reliably? And a big part of this may have to do with the rubric that you create. Because performance assessments require a lot of planning and grading, you should make sure that the skill to be measured is an important one. Don't waste your time and the student's time by creating a performance assessment for one small component of the course. This should be a summative type of assessment to add to your inferences about the student's ability to understand and master the unit objectives. Performance tests are great because they provide authentic learning tasks to help students apply their knowledge. They also elicit higher level thinking skills that we want to encourage in our classrooms. Though these types of assessments are more difficult to evaluate, we take care to create rubrics that are reliable and valid for assessing these tasks appropriately. So in this example, you'll see a question that's in the textbook about the Parent Advisory Council asking about why teachers may use performance tests instead of paper pencil tests. So I want you to think about how you may respond to this type of situation. So rubrics are an important component of performance assessments, and evaluative criteria need to be determined ahead of time so that the students know how to prepare and complete the task. As a teacher, you need to first decide on the standards to be used in the rubric. In the rubric, you'll have rows and columns. Usually the rows will contain different evaluative criteria, and the columns will have the different descriptions to indicate the qualitative differences of those criteria on which to determine students' performances. And this is how I have most of my rubrics set up. So across the top indicates the different degrees, and down the side of the rubric shows the different evaluative criteria. So it's recommended that you not have more than 4 criteria, because that way it will prevent the rubric from being too overwhelming, both to you as the teacher in addition to your students. So then you'll decide whether you'll create a holistic score based on a summary of all the students' responses, or assign different scores for each evaluative criteria. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, but you'll need to decide what works best for you. So usually there will be more than one criterion employed. You can see this example of a numbered scale where each criterion is assigned a different number of points. And so this looks a little bit different than what you've seen, say, in my class and other classes, but you would assign some type of a score, a number score. So there are some criteria to consider. Some are if you only look at a few criteria, it's going to be much better, because then you won't be overwhelmed. The student won't be overwhelmed. So just consider the most important things that you want students to get out of the rubric. What types of skills do you want to be able to assess? What's important. You can ask a colleague for help, someone who has taught that subject or used rubrics. But you want to isolate just a few of instructionally addressable criteria. And then the greatest payoff, of course, is that it can help you to improve instruction. When you find out what students know and how students do, you can give it back to them to help them, and then you can use it to inform your future instructional practices. So there are different types of rubrics that we'll talk about. One is a task-specific rubric, and these are used sometimes. The problem is that you'll have to make one for each task, and will not have as much of a picture of the student's ability to complete multiple performances of that activity. So in this particular class, I used task-specific rubrics. But if you were going to be teaching skills, the same types of skills throughout the school year, you might not want to have a task-specific rubric for every single activity or performance that students have. You may want to have a couple of rubrics you can use again and again, and I'll show you some examples of those later. So here's an example. Compose a narrative essay to describe the class